So my name's Marina, and over the last year or so, I've been doing research with Dr. Elsa Schaefer and a statistician in Illinois State University to really get into understanding model comparison for epidemic models and specifically for cholera. So first, cholera is a bacteria that affects 3 to 5 million people a year, and over 100,000 deaths come from it. How do you get cholera? You ingest this bacteria from a reservoir, from not washing your hands, and basically it goes into your intestine where it colonizes and creates a bunch of nastiness in the case of diarrhea, vomiting, any other way that you could possibly get dehydrated. And the only therapy for it, one of the main ones that's being used, is rehydration. So obviously if you're getting dehydrated, you need to get rehydrated to get better. So in the research that we did was for the epidemic in Haiti in 2010, 2011. And this is a map of Haiti from the CDC. And you can see how each of the different departments got hit differently. So the departments you can think of kind of as states. And Port-au-Prince is the capital of Haiti, and it's also listed on here, but it's listed separately. The darker colors are the areas that got affected more than the lighter colors. So the data that we received kind of came in these bar graphs. And obviously it's not perfect. And that's the point I want to make here, is that the data that we receive as modelers isn't always perfect. It's usually messy, and we usually have to go through a complicated process, or maybe a simple process, but we have to extract it, and it's not always good. So just keep that in mind. So we're working with, dirty data. So here are the models that we use. So the models that mathematicians use, and specifically for epidemics, we're going to be looking at deterministic models. So for these, it's going to be a time series. So for day 1, there was this many hospitalizations, day 2, this many, so on and so forth. For a statistician, a model means something completely different. For a statistician, it's how data is distributed randomly. So when I'm talking about these models, we're talking on a time series basis. So this is the simplest model. It's SIR, susceptible, infected, and recovered. And people move at some rates according to the arrows from one group to the next. Now, this doesn't really have much of the mechanistic understanding of cholera that we have. So this leads us to kind of add to this model, and that's where we get this second model, which is SIRB, and this is the model that most modelers use for cholera. The reason for this is because it has this bacterial class. This bacterial class is basically where you're going to get infected from. So people that are infected contribute to the bacterial class, and the bacterial class is then in turn affects the people that are susceptible. So that's what the arrows represent. And then we also wanted to look at more complicated models, because these models are the ones that are going to help us understand cholera in kind of the biological sense and include much of the understanding that we have about it. So for cholera specifically, we know that there's a symptomatic and an asymptomatic group of people. So when you're asymptomatic, you're not showing any of the symptoms. So you appear to be normal, but you're actually carrying the infection, and you could be infecting other people. And the amount is kind of unknown. Some estimate it to be 30%, some estimate it to be higher, some lower. So this is not something that is a concrete number of people or a percentage of people. And then there's also a high and low infectivity. So for high and low infectivity, when the bacteria is shed from your body, it is 700 times more infectious in the beginning than it is towards the end of its life cycle. So that's why we have two infection classes. The next model still keeps the asymptomatic and symptomatic, but it combines the high and low infectivity into one group, because it assumes person-to-person interaction is the same as having the high and low infectivities. And in the literature, models 3 and 4 are theorized to be very similar and to produce similar results. And we wanted to keep that in mind and see if our model comparison technique would actually validate that or invalidate that as well. This last model looks very complicated. So don't don't worry if you don't understand it. But in a nutshell, it just includes a group of people that were infected that have some sort of immunity now. And it includes all of the other craziness that was going on before. So now this leads us to model comparison. We have those 5 models. So how do we as mathematicians, as modelers, decide which model is the best? So as I mentioned earlier, statisticians think of models as like a randomly distributed data. For us, we were using time series. So what is model selection? So imagine that you have these dots, and you have this the green and the red model. Model selection is basically like, which model is better? Which model fits the data better? So that's, in a nutshell, what model selection is. And specifically, we looked at the Akaike information criteria, which I will be calling AIC from here on, because that's a mouthful. So in a paper in 1973, Akaike proposed this basis for model selection, which estimated the expected Kullback-Leibler distance. So what is that? Basically, if you assume that this red line is what is the true reality, which is unknown, and you have this green line as your model, the Kullback-Leibler distance is the distance between the two. It's kind of an error. So Akaike used this distance to create criteria for selecting models. And it's called the Akaike information criteria. And I'm going to show you a bunch of equations, and don't pay too close attention to them. Don't get lost in them. But so basically what this did was he created a criteria that would look at a number of days multiplied by the log of the error of the fit, that's that distance, plus 2 times the number of parameters. And the point of this was to look at model comparison in a way that would penalize the models that have a ton of parameters, but it would also penalize those that didn't have enough parameters based on how good they fit the data. And then in the literature, and for our case, the kind that would fit most is this formulation, but there's also the traditional case, which uses the likelihood function, which is slightly different than the sigma squared. And it also requires data from a randomly distributed distribution, so that statistical distribution. So the point of it is that you want that KL distance to be minimized. So you're looking at the smallest value of AIC, and AIC is a value that you're going to get for each candidate model. And then in the literature, there is also an understanding that the Bayesian information criteria, another type of formulation, should be the same as AIC. It should tell you the same model as the winner should be selected. Our question is that true? I mean, it's not an estimator of the same kind of distance. It measures a different thing. So how can we say that it has to be the same as the AIC if it's measuring something different? And then with these values, the values themselves have no meaning unless we're comparing them to each other. So in our case, we have 5 candidate models, and that would be the I's. So each model has its own AIC value, and then from that, you're going to subtract the minimum. So of the 5, there's going to be a value that's going to be the smallest. You're going to subtract that smallest value from all of the others, and that's going to give you small, hopefully, differences. Depending on how small is going to give you the empirical support for the data. So if it's between 0 and 2, the model you're looking at is close or relatively close to the model you should be selecting. The model that is selected is going to be 0 because it's the minimum and you're subtracting its own value from itself. And as you get higher and higher, there's substantially less support for your model. So what did we do? Well, in the literature, there's so many formulations, and everybody says that I've used this formulation, and here are my results, and I'm positive that they're right. But then another researcher could say the same thing, and they're using a slightly different formulation. So can they both be right? Or is there a correct formulation? And then another thing is that BIC. Should it actually be the same since it's measuring something different? And lastly, we looked at Haiti in terms of its departments, but is there a way to look at it in terms of the entire country? So can we combine those data sets? So this is all of the equations that I talked about. So in a nutshell, the different formulations are listed on there. So as you can see, there's plenty of them. So here are our results. All right, so before you freak out and try and read this thing, each of these is a model, one of the 5 little graphs I showed earlier. And each of these is one of the departments. And the last thing on there is the total. So that's how we combined our AIC and how we viewed it. Now, what you really want to focus on are the colors that are bright. So this bright green. So that means that the model selected was this model. For model 2 was selected for all of these different formulations. So in theory, model 1 should never be selected because it's too simple and it doesn't include much of the understanding that we have about cholera. And model 5 should also not be selected for the opposite reason, because it's too complicated. So what we see is that, yes, model 2 is being selected, good. Model 3 is being selected sometimes. But when we combine the results for the total, although each of the independent, departments are selecting this model, when we combine this, it actually selects model 3. So this leads us to our conclusions and understanding is that there's actually much to be understood here. And a lot of it, the people that are publishing this information don't have this statistical background. And unfortunately, this may lead them down a path of choosing the wrong model. And another thing is, why is it that when we look at each department separately, they're selecting one thing, but when we combine them all together, it's selecting a different model? And then, as I mentioned earlier, in theory, model 3 and 4 should be selecting the same thing, but they're not. So these are some of our future directions and what we hope to study. And this research has shown me that mathematical modeling is where I want to go in my life. So actually, we'll be continuing my research, maybe not this, but at University of Illinois Chicago at a PhD program in applied math. So thank you.